The air in the studio was deceptively calm. What the cameras didn't capture was the tremor in the prince's hands as he adjusted his jacket, or the subtle unease in the crew's body language, small things only visible to someone paying attention. But nobody was really paying attention. Not yet, because no one, not even Prince Harry himself, had the slightest clue just how far this interview would spiral. Tonight was supposed to be simple. Another carefully managed promotional spot on another late-night couch, a witty host, a few quips about life outside Buckingham Palace, and some emotional resonance to plug the book. That was the playbook. It had worked before, but Jon Stewart didn't read from other people's scripts, and tonight he had questions. Not the kind scribbled on blue cards handed over by PR teams, the kind that left bruises. Harry had barely settled into the plush leather guest chair on the Daily Show stage when he noticed something was off. Jon's entrance lacked the typical fanfare. No dancing, no chuckling with the band, just a slow, deliberate walk to center stage and a glance longer than necessary toward his guest. There was something unspoken in Jon's eyes, something edged with steel. "Your Royal Highness," Jon said with a theatrical bow, his voice velvety with irony. Harry chuckled a little too quickly. "Just Harry is fine, thanks." Jon's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just Harry," he repeated, settling into his seat. "How democratic of you." The audience laughed. Harry did too. But the first seed of discomfort had already been planted. The host wasn't smiling with him. He was smiling at him. "I've read your book," Jon began, tapping the thick hardcover on his desk with 2 fingers. "All of it. Twice. Twice?" Harry asked, raising an eyebrow. "Once for content," Jon said. "The second time for tone." A pause. Then, sharper, interesting tone. That Harry's jaw tensed, barely perceptibly. He was still smiling, but his spine had straightened ever so slightly. Years of royal conditioning taught him to detect danger not by what was said, but how. He was beginning to hear it now in Jon's rhythm. Jon's first few questions were clever, even charming. Teasing Harry about life in California, banter about Netflix deals and avocado toast, but there was a tightness in Jon's delivery. His words hit like darts, disguised as jokes, and then came the pivot. "So," Jon said, flipping to a marked page in the memoir. "Let's talk about your father." Harry hesitated. "Just a second. Chapter 16, Jon continued. "Mention a private conversation where the king your father asked you to delay making your decision public. You called it manipulation. Do you stand by that?" Harry blinked, stunned by the directness. "Yes, I do." Jon leaned in, his voice lower. "And you don't think that was, I don't know, a violation of trust?" The audience quieted. This wasn't the laugh track portion anymore. "I told my truth," Harry said firmly. Jon nodded slowly. "Your truth, not the truth." "Jon, I'm just trying to understand," Jon interrupted, his voice deceptively calm. "You say you want privacy. You say you hate the media circus, but you wrote a tell-all. You signed a Netflix deal. You're sitting here now in a soundstage. Does that look like privacy to you?" A single cough from the audience cut through the silence like a bullet. Harry's smile had disappeared completely. "This isn't about attention," he replied, voice tight. "It's about accountability. About correcting the lies that were told." "Lies," Jon echoed, cutting him off. "Lies told about you. So you responded by telling lies about them." "I didn't lie," Harry said, louder now. "Fine," Jon said, eyes narrowing. "You told the truth, your truth, and you sold it to the highest bidder." The words landed like a slap. What followed wasn't a conversation, it was a duel. The weapons weren't swords or fists, but words sharpened with personal pain and public humiliation. Jon pressed harder, picking apart Harry's motives with surgical precision. "You say you were silenced," Jon said, "but you've had global platforms. Oprah, Spotify, Netflix, this book. You've had more voice than most people will ever get." Harry leaned forward, frustration seeping into his tone. "That's not the same. I was trapped. I couldn't speak for myself. But you're speaking now," Jon said, unmoved. Loudly, and for millions of dollars. The audience laughed, but this time it wasn't a laugh of joy. It was the uneasy laughter of a room unsure. Whether it was supposed to be enjoying itself, Harry's knuckles were white against the armrests. "I didn't ask for this life," he said. "But you're cashing in on it," Jon replied. And then the moment shifted. It wasn't a punchline, it wasn't a joke. It was real. Jon said, almost softly, "You lost your mother. That is a pain I can't imagine. But you've turned that tragedy into a brand, a narrative, a career." Harry's head snapped toward him. "How dare you, Jon? Didn't blink. I dare because you're here, on my show, selling that story. And you want everyone to feel sorry for you but not to question you. You're twisting everything," Harry said, eyes glassy. "I've helped people. I've spoken about mental health. That's real. And so is the hurt you've caused," Jon said. "To your father, your brother, even your stepmother." "They hurt me first," Harry snapped. "And you retaliated," Jon said. "You didn't rise above it, you turned it into chapters." There was no laughter now, no music, no musa, no applause. Only the sound of two men breathing heavily into microphones that were suddenly too intimate. Harry stood up. He didn't even realize he'd done it. His body moved before his mind caught up. "I don't have to take this," he said. Jon looked up at him, still seated. "Then don't." Harry hesitated, one beat, two, then slowly sat. Back down, the rage in his chest, simmering like a volcano, barely held in check. Jon let the silence hang. He knew the power of a pause. Then, softly, "Why come here, Harry? Why keep doing this to yourself if it only makes things worse?" "Because I have to," Harry said, the edge in his voice fraying. "Because if I don't tell my side, they'll keep controlling the story." Jon gave a slow nod. "And in doing that, you've become exactly what you say you hate." That's when Harry broke, not with tears, but with silence. A long, drawn-out silence that said more than any sound ever could. The silence in the studio was no longer awkward. It was electric. You could feel it humming in the air, like a storm just seconds from cracking open the sky. Even the studio lights, so carefully arranged for warmth and clarity, now seemed to harsh like they were exposing something no one was meant to see. Prince Harry sat motionless, lips pressed into a tight line, eyes unfocused, as if he were somewhere else entirely. Jon Stewart watched him, not with triumph, but with a strange, quiet intensity, like a man performing open-heart surgery with no anesthesia. "Harry," Jon finally said, his voice almost gentle now, "you don't have to defend yourself, too." "Me?" Harry blinked. "That's exactly what I've been doing this whole time." Jon nodded. "I know. And that's the problem." Another beat. Another pause stretched too long. "You think I came here to attack you," Jon continued. "But I didn't. I came here because I think you're lying to yourself." The words were soft, but the impact brutal. The audience collectively inhaled. Harry looked up, his voice brittle. "You don't know me." "No," Jon agreed. "But I know what pain looks like when it's wearing a mask, and I know what it feels like to believe your own PR." Harry didn't respond, so Jon kept going. "Let me ask you something," Jon said, leaning forward again, his fingers steepled together. "You've said you left the royal family to protect your wife and kids from media abuse, right?" Harry nodded slowly. "And in the same breath, you signed up for a global documentary series, wrote a tello, and now you're on a book tour where every interview reopens, wounds yours and theirs." Harry flinched. "So who are you really protecting?" Jon asked, quieter now. "Them or you?" Harry's mouth opened, but no words came out. "I know what self-justification looks like," Jon continued. "It's a drug. I've used it. When I tore into politicians on this show, when I eviscerated people in power, I always told myself it was about truth, justice. Punching up," he paused, "but sometimes it was just because it felt good, because I was angry, because I could." The audience listened in stunned silence. "And I wonder, Harry," Jon said, eyes narrowing again, "if that's what this is for you." Harry's voice finally returned, but it was a whisper, coiled with fury. "Don't you dare compare what I've lived through to late-night satire." "I'm not," Jon said flatly. "I'm comparing what you've done with it." Harry stood again. "This isn't entertainment, Jon. This is my life." "Then stop selling it like content," Jon snapped. His own temper rising now, the words collided in the air like steel on steel. "You say you're not here for attention," Jon said, "but every move you make leads back to a camera, a platform, a paycheck." "I've raised awareness for mental health," Harry shot back. "For veterans, for trauma survivors." "Yes," Jon said. "And you could have done all that without dragging your family through the dirt." Harry's voice cracked, raw and unguarded. "I was drowning. No one helped me. The institution let me suffer. And so you made them pay," Jon replied coldly. "Not just with guilt, but with exposure." A woman in the front row gasped audibly. Harry's hands balled into fists. "You don't know what it's like." "No," Jon said, "but I know what this is. This is revenge, dressed up as healing." "I'm telling my story," Harry insisted, voice louder now. "But it's not just your story," Jon shouted. "You didn't just write about your pain, you wrote about theirs. Your brother's panic attacks, your father's grief, your stepmother's struggles to be accepted." He pointed toward the memoir on the desk. "You opened the family vault and handed out skeleton keys, and then called it therapy." Harry sat back down, but not gently. His breathing was erratic now, chest rising and falling like waves in a storm. The prince was unraveling, and the cameras still rolling captured every fractured expression. Jon saw it, and for the first time, he hesitated, but it was too late. The line had been crossed. There was no going back. The audience wasn't clapping anymore. They weren't laughing either. They were transfixed, frozen. Not just watching a show, but watching something real, something unspooled and ugly and human. A manto men breaking themselves open in front of them. Jon leaned back, voice low again. "You know what I think happened?" Harry didn't look at him. "I think you tried to build a new life out of the ashes of your old one. But instead of walking away from the fire, you carried it with you. And now you're burning down everything around you to keep warm." That was the line, the one that cut deepest. Harry's voice was barely audible. "I lost my mother, Jon." Jon's reply was immediate. "So did millions of kids. You don't own grief." Harry's jaw clenched. "You're twisting this." "No," Jon said. "I'm just saying what everyone else is too scared to." And then came the pivot nobody expected. From across the studio, a voice shouted, "Let him speak!" Everyone turned. A man in the audience had stood up, eyes blazing. "He's not a villain," the man continued. "He's a survivor." Security started to move, but Jon waved them off. Harry looked up shocked, and maybe grateful, but Jon turned to the man and asked, "Then why does it feel like everyone else had to bleed so he could heal?" Silence returned. Colder now, deeper, more irreversible. Jon leaned forward one last time. "You want people to understand you, Harry. Fine. But understand this: telling your story doesn't make you brave. It makes you loud. What makes you brave is what you choose not to say, what you protect, what you don't sell." Harry stood again, and this time he didn't sit back down. "I've said enough," he murmured. Jon didn't move. "Maybe for the first time in your life," he said. "You're right. The lights didn't fade, the cameras didn't stop, the world just held its breath." There are moments in live television when time doesn't just slow down, it fractures. You don't realize it until later, but in the moment, everything becomes unbearable. Clear, the hum of the lights, the stillness of the cameras, the creak of a leather chair as someone stands. These moments don't belong to writers or directors. They belong to instinct. And right now, his stance, he didn't fidget. He didn't pace. He stood tall, shoulders square, eyes fixed directly on Jon Stewart, like a man preparing for war. The silence in the studio was absolute. This wasn't an interview anymore. This was an autopsy. And the body on the table was everything Harry had spent years trying to protect, or perhaps convince himself he was protecting. "You've sat there," Harry said, voice cold, "judging every word I've ever spoken, every step I've taken, like you've lived it, like you know." Jon didn't flinch. "I don't know your life, Harry. I know your choices. That's not the same thing." "No," Jon said, "but choices speak louder than trauma." Ripple went through the audience. Some shifted, uncomfortable. Others leaned in, eyes gleaming. Harry pointed at the copy of his memoir, still sitting on the desk between them. "That book, that was my life, laid bare. Not for attention, not for profit, but for the record." Jon cocked his head slightly. "Then why does it read like a revenge script?" Harry's lips tightened. "You think telling the truth is revenge? I think telling only your truth while exposing everyone else's pain in the process is manipulative," Jon replied. "And you think you're the authority on what's honest?" "No," Jon said calmly. "But I know what hypocrisy smells like, and this studio stinks of it tonight." Audible, but it was visible. Harry took a step forward, not threatening, but forceful. "You've made a career mocking people from behind a desk," he said, voice rising. "You sit in judgment, safe behind applause signs and laugh tracks. I lived what I wrote. You turned your pain into punchlines. And you turned yours into profit," Jon replied sharply. "I turned it into purpose." Jon stood now to no Harry. "You turned it into spectacle." The two men stood inches apart, prince and comedian, trauma and satire. Past and present crashing like waves, the studio no longer felt like a safe space. It felt like a minefield, and someone had just stepped on the trigger. "You know what? I see when I look at you," Harry said, his tone low but seething. "I see a bitter man who hides behind sarcasm because he's too afraid to feel anything real." Jon didn't respond right away. His expression didn't change. But something in his eyes hardened. "And I see a man," Jon said, voice clipped, "who thinks suffering gives him a monopoly on sympathy, who believes tragedy erases accountability." You could almost see the breath. Between them, "I buried my mother while the world watched," Harry said, his voice cracking. "I was 12, and you've been asking the world to bury everyone else's boundaries for you ever since." Jon snapped. The audience gasped. This time, faltered, he opened his mouth to walk it back. But Harry beat him to it. "You know what the difference is between you and me?" Harry growled, fury surfacing like magma. "When I break things, I try to rebuild them. You just keep smashing, because broken is the only thing that makes you feel powerful." Room muttered into his headset. "Do we cut this?" A second voice, "No, don't you dare. Let it play." Back in the studio, the tension had calcified. Even the laughter sign operator wasn't moving. There were no cues anymore, only consequences. Jon took a breath. "You think I'm the problem." Here, Harry's voice was quieter now. "I think people like you make it impossible for anyone to be vulnerable without being crucified. I think people like you confuse vulnerability with exploitation," Jon replied. "No," Harry said, louder now. "You confuse authenticity with weakness. That's why people stop talking. That's why they hide in silence, because every time someone dares to open up, someone like you is waiting to twist it." "You're not opening up," Jon said. "You're broadcasting. That's not healing. That's monetizing pain." Harry stepped forward. Again, one step. Then another. He was now right in Jon's face. The prince had dropped his royal mask, and what stood in its place was something raw, pulsing with the rage of decades. The child who walked behind a casket in front of cameras, the teenager who never chose the spotlight but lived under it anyway. The man who fell in love, then watched the woman he loved become a target. "You think this is easy for me?" Harry whispered, "coming on this show, being ripped apart again. Sitting here and listening to you strip everything down to clickbait, the powerful, but now you've become them. You don't ask questions, you throw knives." The silence that followed was unbearable, and then Jon Stewart sat back down, not out of defeat, but out of restraint. "Maybe you're right," he said softly. "Maybe I did go too far." The admission was small, but it echoed like thunder. Harry blinked, stunned. Jon continued, "But let me ask you one last thing, and you don't have to answer. You can walk out, but just hear it." Harry nodded cautiously. Jon leaned forward. "When your kids are older, and they read everything you wrote, every private moment you published, will you be proud?" The question didn't cut it, dismantled. Harry didn't respond. He couldn't. He stared at the floor, and the cameras zoomed in, capturing not just a prince but a man who'd run out of defenses. For the first time tonight, he looked human, not wounded, not righteous, just human. Then he turned and walked off the stage. No explosion, no tantrum, just silence, and a chair left empty beneath the spotlight. Jon sat frozen for a moment, unsure if he'd won or lost something in the process. The crew didn't know whether to fade to black or wait, and the audience still umvi, as if they'd just witnessed a public execution, but weren't sure who had died. The set was still. The empty chair where Prince Harry had sat now looked surreal under the harsh studio lights, like a ghost of what had just occurred. The microphone cord, twisted and limp across the armrest, gave the stage an abandoned look, like a battlefield moments after the final shot was fired. Jon Stewart sat motionless, not triumphant, not smirking, just still. He looked out at the audience, an audience no longer sure whether they were spectators or witnesses to something they shouldn't have seen. No one clapped, no one laughed. Even the floor crew, normally swift to reset, stood frozen behind cameras, staring at the man who had just eviscerated a prince and perhaps himself. In the control room, chaos had broken loose. Producers barked into headsets. Executives were calling down from upstairs. Legal teams were asking for footage logs. Editors stood by, unsure what they were even supposed to cut. The raw feed kept rolling. Not because anyone told them to, but because no one had the nerve to stop it. Back in the studio, Jon finally moved. He reached for the mug on his desk, hands trembling ever so slightly, took a sip, set it down, looked at the camera, and said nothing. For once, Jon Stewart, master of monologues, king of the cutting remark, had no punchline. With exhaustion, his eyes clouded with something dangerously close to regret. He looked at the chair Harry had occupied, as if replaying every word, every blow. And then he sighed. A long, heavy sigh that said more than anything he could have scripted. 3 minutes passed. Then 5. Most of the audience remained seated, unsure if the show was truly over. And then, just as someone started to stand, a voice echoed from backstage. "Do you believe in second chances, Jon?" Every head snapped toward the entrance, and there he was, Prince Harry, backlit by the hallway. His silhouette cast long shadows on the studio floor. The audience gasped. Jon stood speechless. Harry stepped forward, slow, calm, but radiating something different this time, not defiance, not anger, clarity, double quotes. "I shouldn't have walked off," Harry said, as he returned to center stage. "But you shouldn't have gone for blood." Jon nodded slowly. "You're right," Harry gestured toward the audience. "These people, they didn't come here to watch a man be dissected. They came to hear a conversation." Jon swallowed. "And we gave them a duel." "A war," Harry corrected. They stood in silence again. Two men, once adversaries, now somehow tethered by what they had just survived together and what they had destroyed in the process. Harry turned to the audience, his voice low but steady. "Everyone wants to be understood, that's all. Not excused, not idolized, just seen." He turned back to Jon. "You asked me if I'd be proud of what I wrote when my children are old enough to read it. And I've been asking myself that every day since I signed the deal." Jon watched him, this time without judgment. Harry continued, "I didn't write it to hurt anyone, but that doesn't mean people didn't get hurt." And with that simple sentence, he took responsibility. The air changed. Jon sat back down, his voice softer now. "We're not trained for this, you know," he said. "Not this level of fame, not this level of grief, not the cameras, not the silence." Harry nodded. "We both come from broken things," Jon added. "Families, institutions, expectations." "Walls built before we were even born," Harry murmured. "Exactly." They sat quietly for a moment, letting that truth hang in the air like smoke. Then Jon leaned forward. "I'm sorry," he said. The words were simple. Harry blinked, caught off guard. "Not just for tonight," Jon added, "for forgetting that behind every headline is a human being." Harry nodded, swallowing hard. "I'm sorry for walking in here thinking I was untouchable." They both sat in the silence. Not awkward this time. Then Jon turned to the camera. "There are no heroes in this story," he said. "Just two men who've been carrying too much for too long." The audience was still dead silent. Harry stood again. "You know what hurts the most?" he said. "It's not the criticism, or the press, or the betrayal. It's knowing that no matter what I do, my children will inherit the war I couldn't end." Jon looked down, then up again. "That's the part I got wrong," he said. Harry turned to leave once more, but this time it was closure. He paused near the edge of the stage and looked back. "You were right about one thing," Harry said. Jon raised an eyebrow. "I've become what I hate, and now I have to figure out how to unbecome it." Then he walked into the shadows. This time, no one tried to stop him. Cut to black. No outro, no applause, no music, just stillness. And the echo of two men learning that sometimes the bravest thing you can do on live TV is admit you're wrong.